It's great to be here as we're doing, actually started off with a little bit of AI work. We went to the internet and said, what is the most boring title we come up with for a talk on technology and ethics? And we came up with technology and ethics. So I'm glad anybody came tonight. It was really, really straightforward, but I think it's a good content. I think it'll be a good subject area for us. And as we get started, we're gonna have a couple things we talk about, especially if my computer responds in time. A few kind of general categories I'm going to try to go through, but the big idea is not going to be how do we figure out if technology is ethical or not. That's what a lot of people probably want to start off with. That's where we think about technology and ethics a lot, is like what's coming and is that going to be good and should we allow it? But for reasons I'm going to tell you about, especially because of greed and sin, I'm going to say technology almost always gets accepted, whether anybody thinks one way or the other about it ethically. And so we can say all we want about let's figure out whether this is going to be good, but the reality is, yeah, that's good work to do. Most of what we have to do is figure out how is it impacting us right now, and how do we live with it in a way that is Christian. So it's not so much figuring out, is this technology good, and otherwise rejecting it, but actually saying this technology is happening or is coming. How are we going to use it well? How are we going to live with it well? So we'll start off on making that broader case, and there's, I think, to me, is really some fascinating stuff about what technology does in adoption and how invisible it becomes to us. So hopefully that part will be fun for everybody. I will, in the middle, spend some time talking about, hey, that new stuff that's coming, let's do it. Let's talk about how do we think about new stuff? Like, how do we think about if it's ethical? How do we be Christians? How do we biblically think about new things that the Bible doesn't really speak to directly? And most often with technology, there's not a verse you can go to get an answer on is this good or is this bad? So how do we do that? But then the last part is going to be more kind of coming back to the beginning and saying, but let's take a look at our lives and how our lives have been shaped, not by the technology that's coming, but by the technology that's already here, and really saying, like, are we living well with this? Is this good? Are we thinking about this well? And for that, because it's so broad, I'm going to be focusing in on the idea of community and Christian community. So as we kind of jump into that, let me start off with this. This first part is really about technological process. Now, how many of you ever heard the name the Luddites? How many of you know who the Luddites are as people? Okay, so I got one handout, which proves the second part of my title here. I'll have to show you the Luddites always lose, but they also get forgotten. So the Luddites were an actual secret society. This was a secret society in Britain. It was in the early 19th century, and the Luddites were anti-technology people. So those of you that raised your hand for I've heard the word, but said you didn't know who the people were, it's because it's an accusation now. Really, the word Luddite is something you throw out. Anybody that hates technology, you say you're a Luddite. And that's how it's turned into this kind of vocab word that maybe you've heard at some point in time. But the Luddites were a secret society. They were named after a guy who probably didn't exist, named Ted Ludd. And Ted Ludd was famous for having supposedly broken some weaving technology. And the Luddites became a secret society named after Ted Ludd, and they were opposed to the change in basically the textiles industry it was putting people out of work. It was a different process. It was less skilled. It was less labor intensive. It was more mechanical. And so people that were getting put out of work, in order to try to fight off this change in the textile industry and keep it manual labor, they formed a secret society and would go willfully sabotage equipment to try to stop the change in Britain. Well, they lost. Right? I mean, we don't have we're just talking about manual weaving of fabrics. I don't even know how fabrics are made. Not really. Like, I've seen an old weave loom, where you have to move everything back and forth and you do the slider. But this shirt that I'm wearing, I have no idea how this fabric actually got made. I mean, I know it's a big piece of machinery, and I know that it's almost certainly not the United States, but I'm completely out of touch with that. And the Luddites were afraid of that. They were saying, we can't do this. We're going to lose the skills. We've lost the skills. We're going to lose the connection to the people. We've lost the connection to the people. We're going to lose the jobs. We've lost the jobs. And society's going to break down, and society continued. And the fact is that this is just consistent with technological process, that even where people are raising ethical issues, and you can argue that that is not real ethical issues, that's just, I don't know what to do, I'm going to lose my job. But if you're the person who's going to lose your job, it feels pretty real, and it feels pretty bad. Technology, I was thinking about this, I could only come up with one example of a major technology that had the opportunity to significantly change the world that was ever shut down because of ethical concerns. And that was nuclear power. And it didn't get stopped completely, but it is the only example I could think of where a transformational technology, which many people now regret the fact that we didn't go with nuclear power for any number of other reasons, but that's the only transformation technology that I could come up with that was ever significantly blocked, not completely blocked. Otherwise, I could find no examples of technology that had the opportunity to make things cheaper, easier, faster, simpler, more widely distributed that ever got stopped, no matter how significant the ethical concerns were. It doesn't mean everybody participated, but it means that as a general rule, if we start seeing something coming that seems scary, don't think about stopping it. Think about living with it. In other words, think about how do we live in a world with this technology in a way that is positive. Second thing about technology, and I find this really fascinating. Technology reshapes expectations faster than it fulfills them. Let me give you examples of that, and there's any number of them. And it's really wild. So I had a class that I taught in it's called Society, Ethics, and Technology, and we did the history of technology. And it was fascinating how much entire societies got reshaped around really simple technologies. The first example is the washing machine. So when at the time washing machines were invented, people were having to primarily hand wash. And hand washing was a long, arduous process. The average person at that time, and by the way, the textiles industry is moving along and making things cheaper, so that's also a part of it, but the average person only had 2 or 3 suits of clothes. Many people in the US would have had 2. They would have had their Sunday best, and they would have had their work clothes. That would have been, in terms of outside of the house suits of clothes, many people were living with 2 items of clothing. Now, the work clothes got worn every day. You didn't wash nightly, and I'm sure by Friday they were hard to be around. But you had those 2 suits of clothes, and then you did laundry. And laundry by hand for a family, even with only 2 suits of clothes, was an all-day event. So the washing machine comes along. Between washing machines and dryers, you can radically reduce the amount of time it takes to clean 2 suits of clothing. And what did we do? See, the expectation is, I just want to do laundry for less time. That's what we think we want. I want to do laundry more quickly. But as soon as we have the opportunity to do laundry more quickly, what happened? Everybody got more laundry. And the amount of time spent doing laundry stayed just about the same. And there's people that have researched this and shown it. We got vacuum cleaners, so it was easier to clean the floors. And we added wall-to-wall carpeting, and we got bigger houses. We kept the amount of time spent cleaning about the same. Kitchens got bigger, even though the amount of food that we actually cooked got smaller. We got air conditioning. And so we moved into places where that were hotter, like Florida. We got better roads and better cars, and so we moved further away from our work. So we spent about the same amount of time getting to and from work. And you can look overall at society, and this is something that's just fascinating, that technology, generally speaking, reshapes our expectations rather than ever fulfilling them. And we could say, pull out your phones right now and think about your expectations. I mean, if you communicated with a friend in Africa 100 years ago, you would not expect to hear anything back for months. Now, some of you could communicate with a friend in Africa while I was talking and be mad if they hadn't responded before I got to the next bullet point. It changes the expectation. Rather than being happy it doesn't take a month, we're mad we didn't hear back in 30 seconds. And then the last one, and it's connected to that, is that unintended consequences become invisible consequences. And what I mean by that is, it's not an intended consequence of the washing machine that we buy more clothes. It's not an intended consequence of home cleaning technology generally that we build bigger houses. It's not an intended consequence of the interstate system that we live further away from our work. But those were real consequences of it, and after time, those become invisible. We don't even think about them as change anymore. And real quick before we go on to the next segment of this, that's true in the church too. And so I've got this kind of this picture off on the side, but if you kind of go down through this, I want you to think about technology and how it's impacted the church. So the first thing, the microphone. Now, the microphone right here in this room is a convenience. I could speak loud enough that most people could hear. But the microphone's a great convenience for a room this size, and this is about the size that many churches would have been for most of history. There were cathedrals that were enormous, and many of them were built with acoustics that were natural so that you could hear in the back of the room, but many churches were just really small, and adding a microphone was a convenience. But when you add the convenience of the microphone, what does it do? It makes it possible to have a bigger church. The car, I would argue there's probably no technology in all of human history that has done more to divide the church than the car. If you think about a time period when the only way to get to church was on foot, what church were you going to go to? Now be honest about yourself. What church were you going to go to? You weren't going to go to a church that's 20 miles away, but you love the theology. You were going to go to the church that was close by. You were going to have a town church, and you would have, in many circumstances, you'd have much more theological breadth with any one single church because people were going because of transportation, frankly. But now when we have the ability to jump in a car, and then when we build out interstate systems and we build out roads that are better and they continuously get better and people continuously go further away, we start be able to self-select our church more and more by what we like about it, what we're getting from it. If it's like us, if it's like our expectations, all of that. And then we can become more and more isolated. Now, it doesn't just produce denominations. It also produces megachurches, because it's not all of us that are looking for a church that's all like-minded. Sometimes we're looking for a church that does what we want, and if you can find the entertainment. And notice, then the churches realize we can get more people if we're more entertaining. And the TV, which this church was a participant in that, one of the very first megachurches, because of the application of television to church and the use of television to now have a worldwide audience as opposed to membership. You can't really be a member of a community when you're an audience member, when you're just looking at a TV, but you are able to be influenced by it. The internet now makes that possible. Not only can you broadcast it live, but I can go leave here and I can listen to any sermon. Now, that's not going to any church, but I can listen to just about any sermon there is, and with my phone in my pocket that's only temporarily out and I feel a little weird because of it, with my phone, it's with me always and everywhere. And so what happens to the church over time? Well, these little churches that were given a little bit of help by a microphone now become bigger and bigger and have broader audience. And what does that put the emphasis on? You know what? In a room this size, I can get to know everybody. And if I was the pastor of this church, I could know everybody and be your pastor. And if you knew me and you liked me, and if I was closest, you might come anyways, even if you didn't, we might have a relationship that went way past how well I spoke and how well I preached. It would be about our pastoral relationship. But when you add cars, now I'd better be a little better because there's somebody else they could go see. And you add cameras, now I really better be good on camera, and maybe I even have to look good. And you add the internet and you add people's phones, and not only do the churches grow, not only can we pick where we want to go, but the emphasis becomes the pulpit versus the pastorate generally, and on the performance versus pastoring. This is just an unintended consequence that now is almost invisible. When we think about a great pastor, we're almost incapable of thinking first about relationships and hospital visits, accountability, discipleship, because we're so focused on how do they preach and do I love listening to all of it. And it's not that preaching isn't a major part of the church. It's that this, and worship, by the way, also gets plugged in here. It's that the technology has actually driven us to take one good piece of the total package and elevate it above all other. And that's nobody thought, hey, let's tell people to get cars so that they'll come to our church instead of the one that's closer to them. Nobody thought, let's do TV. so we can break down the small local church. Nobody thought, let's put our sermons online so people will quit going to church altogether. But those are unintended consequences that actually become invisible. We become so used to them, we don't even think about them anymore. So with that kind of laid out in terms of technology, as I said, the idea that we're not going to stop it. We're not going to stop it. I want to shift to kind of what probably many people were expecting here, which is, but how do we think about new stuff? Because I'm talked so far about old stuff, but how do we think about new stuff? And then we're going to come back around to trying to examine our lives for the way technology has already shaped them. So how do we biblically think through new topics? Well, one of the things that's interesting, and one of the classes that I teach at the seminary, and so I'm trying to get pastors trained. I tell them, like, listen, there are going to be people that come up to you with some questions you've never thought about before. So I want you to have a process you can go through where you can think about stuff, at least where you can say, I've never thought about that before. Let's figure out, how do we apply the Bible to new technologies? So I have a standing assignment in the class, and it's a science fiction assignment, basically. Now, it is for now. It probably won't be by the time I die. In other words, I've picked something that scientists are actively working on that I know will have huge ethical ramifications. And one or two people in this room have actually had to do this before. And I said, tell me what you're going to say biblically about this. Tell me what the process would look like to say something biblically. And the thing that I pick is an artificial womb. Those people working on an artificial womb. They haven't done it yet. It hasn't been accomplished yet for human beings. And maybe it never will be. But it won't be because anybody ethically says stop. If they never get it done, it'll be because the technological hurdles stay too big. An artificial womb. So right now we do in vitro fertilization, but then we have to take those embryos and we have to put them back into real people. So we can have the nice laboratory for a while, but then it has to go back into a person. But what about when we don't need the person anymore? What about when we can just embryo into a vat and have the embryo grow out and get fed through machines and just go all the way through, grow up in the laboratory? It's in science fiction movies all the time. It's always really creepy in those rooms. The lights aren't on when you first walk in, but then they flicker and turn on, and it's kind of red juice, and you can just sort of see the baby growing in it. But people are really trying to do that. What are we going to say about that? What does the Bible say about that? Where do you go in Scripture for the verses about whether or not it's okay to use an artificial womb? So I talk to the students, say, think about that. And so as we think about that process, and I'm going to do this part really quick because it can get really long. So if you're the 1 in 10 that actually find it interesting, you may be a little mad that we go so fast. But for the most part, the process stuff is not usually the most exciting part of what anybody's ever talking about. I tell the students, I said, one of the first things that's really interesting is often we think we know what the ethical question is, but we don't really know. So it sounds like it's just like, do we use an artificial womb? Or should I get a vaccine? Or should I wear a mask? We've had those big ethical questions that are semi-technological, especially the vaccine one that came up in the church recently. But I get these all the time. We've got lots of questions that are, sexual ethics questions about homosexuality and questions like that. And people think that their question is the question you're taking to Scripture, is this right or is this wrong? Often there's nuance to it. Often it's not obvious what the real question is. I mean, if a restaurant, and I'll apply this again later. If a restaurant tells me that to put on a shirt to walk in the door, I don't think there's anything weird about that. But if somebody tells me to put on a mask, then I'm really upset about it. So why is the one different than the other? Is it about masks, or there's something else going on? Because when a restaurant tells me put on this piece of fabric, I don't mind, and everybody else is happy too. But when they tell me to put something over my face, I'm like, my face is way better than my body, though. It's then we're mad and we're upset. What's going on there? We got to figure out what is the real question we're asking. And part of that, and I think this part's really hard for us, particularly in our culture today, is as you go through and you process new technology, it's really important to think, what do you want the answer to be? And not only just you, but what do the people around you want the answer to be? We are intensely shaped by our preconceptions and by our community. And I'd love to talk about the community shaping more because it's fascinating how much, if you're in a room with a consensus and you disagree, it is incredibly powerful to hold on to your position, even if it's obviously right and everybody around you is crazy. There's just something powerful about the people that we're around. And so as we try to examine what we want, this goes both ways. I'm kind of a technophile person, like a technology lover. I naturally think, yeah, that'll be great. Some people are Luddites, right? They just naturally think that's going to be terrible. You need to know, because as you go in, if I think about an artificial womb, the first things that I think of are not the horrible parts of that. The first things I think of are the ways this could be really fantastic technology in some places for some people. I mean, it could be possible that you could transfer babies that otherwise would be lost. It could open the door for people that can't have children otherwise. But some of you are thinking, how do you even come up with that? All I can think of is the laboratory, and you're disconnecting moms from their children, and people are going to be able to have kids without any connection whatsoever, and the babies are going to grow up in a lab, and they're going to be heartless, and there's no heartbeat, and what's going to destroy them? And if I go in, I have to go in skeptical of being positive, because I am positive. And if you're terrified, you need to go in skeptical of being terrified, because you're terrified. In other words, it's really easy to open the Bible up and confirm what we already think. And so part of the process of approaching new things is intentionally trying to be disagreeable with yourself and the people around you. Now I've got this note on here about our culture. This is really, really hard right now. There have been time periods that really emphasized getting the best argument for their position. If you were ever part of a debate team, they always said, make sure that you can present the other person's side better than they can present it. Our culture right now, I hear people still talk about postmodernism and relativism. Relativism's dead, and postmodernism is dead. We're not relativists anymore. We are not happy with other viewpoints. We do not tell people believe whatever you want to believe and it's all okay. That is done and gone. It died. It's moved into a new thing, which unfortunately can feel a little better to the church. That was never going to work for the church, because Jesus says, go tell everybody I'm the only way, and relativism says, go tell everybody that that's fine if they think that, but it's not really true, unless it makes them feel good. It was always in conflict. The culture now, think about our culture now. We're not happy with other viewpoints. We are angry with them. We don't look for counter arguments. We already know the truth, and we go looking for people to confirm what we already know. We're anti-critical. We're not thinking hard. We're looking for confirmation. We scour the internet. And by the way, the internet is designed, we'll talk about it soon, to feed us people who agree with us. In fact, people who agree with us and are even more radical. And we get these feeds, and so we go expert shopping, find somebody who agrees with me, find a theologian. If you're having an argument with your friend about predestination, what you do is you don't go listen to people that are wrong about it, but thoughtfully wrong about it. You go listen to people that are right, whatever viewpoint you have, and can do it better. And then you bring more arguments, and you come back in, and maybe you tweet about how dumb your friend is because he isn't listening, and he hasn't listened to this, and he hasn't done that. We look for experts who confirm us, and if we're going to look for the other viewpoint, we look for idiots who disagree. We expert shop and we idiot shop. We actually are willfully against having our viewpoints pushed off. And the fundamentalism part, that we treat everything like a religious belief. It's stunning how many things people treat as if these are deeply, tightly held salvific matters. I've had some fun arguments, and there's probably some people in here that would do it. We can do that at a different time about masks. I'm like, it's a piece of paper. I don't like it. It makes my glasses get foggy. I don't have to wear them anymore. I'm so happy. I learned not to eat cheese for lunch because that's really horrible inside of a mask, but it's just a piece of paper that I put on my face. That's all it was. It was just a piece of paper. But masks, and here's what I think is interesting. If you disagree with me about that, that's fine. So we would disagree and we have a conversation, but that's not how the disagreement goes. People left churches over mask policies. People left churches where they agreed theologically with everything the church was saying to go to churches where they disagreed with them theologically. They disagreed with them in terms of their worship style. They disagreed with them in terms of the function of the church, and where they were leaving a community they knew because of mask policies. Masks are not matters of salvation. They're not, but they were treated that way, that we would divide churches over these things, even if you think they are worthless. There's lots of work. Some people are wearing the wrong socks, but we go to different churches. Our culture right now is hard on us for thinking well. because it tells us not to get any counter arguments. So actually, before we even go to Scripture, we try to understand what we think and we try to fight against it. Now we go to Scripture. Now, Scripture doesn't give us a lot. In fact, if I were to talk about the artificial womb, most of the Scripture that we would get would probably feel like it would be in the camp of that, just because Scripture is pro-life and the artificial womb is pro-life. But what Scripture are you going to go to figure out whether or not we should use an artificial womb? There's nothing on that directly. Unfortunately, with technology, if people are making a biblical case, very often they're stretching things way beyond where they need to be. But we still need to think about it. Like, an artificial womb is really probably coming. It's really probably going to be here in the time that I'm alive, and I'm going to have to change the assignment and pick something else that's even weirder to get students to do it, because we're going to have to be doing that as a real thing that's really happening, that we're really dealing with, that's really out there. So we got to do more than just say Scripture doesn't speak to it and just move on. What do we do from there? One of the things we do is we look for analogies, and we also look through church history for any kind of similar cases. So for the artificial womb, analogies, in vitro fertilization would be a help to that. Generally speaking, reproductive technology, we'd start to look for things, what have we done? What has medicine brought to us that's been helpful for getting babies to term, but that also has negative consequences? In vitro fertilization is not a closed, obvious case. There's real ethical concerns about it because there's embryos that get made in many cases and left in a tank. There's things that we need to be thinking about. But the best analogies are situations that are as similar as possible. And then we go back and we say, if I have to start from scratch, that's no good, but let me go read the different things the church said about in vitro fertilization. And even if it's not going to be an exact match, it'll help me to think this through. It'll help me to find some processes, some ways to think. And so it won't give me the total answer, but it gives me some help and some support. Analogies are, and I'll go back to the mask thing again, if we're talking about, should the government be able to tell you to put on a mask? And I'll give you a range of analogies that I've heard on that. No, it's just like when the Nazis made people put a gold star on their shirt, or it's just like when the government tells you to put on shoes and shirt when you go into a restaurant, or it's just like when the government says you're not allowed to be naked in public. So those are all analogies in the sense that they're cases where the government is saying wear fabric. And so which is the right analogy? Well, if you're fair, you're going to be thinking through the similarity of case. What's the reasoning? So is the gold star really the best analogy? It is a piece of fabric, or is because that one was racially divisive and was intended to identify people for later death, is it that's a good analogy, or is it that that's just rhetoric and you're trying to win the argument? We look for analogies that are the most like the thing that we're talking about, and it would probably be the one about just general health codes that say wear gloves when you're working with food, that kind of thing. That would be an ethical analogy, a thing like it, to try to examine what we ought to think as Christians about this. Which again doesn't mean we have to like it. It doesn't have to mean we think it's good policy. It's just thinking through how do we approach it ethically. Then this is the next part that I think is important in the process, and we'll be ready to move on, but that I think we also don't like very much. You're probably going to be wrong when you get through all that work. Because the first people to answer ethical questions almost always are wrong. Not completely wrong, but usually it takes a while. In vitro fertilization, we're still arguing about in vitro fertilization, and that's been going on for, I think it's 60 years now. I forget the exact date of the first time that it happened. We still don't have the answers all the way nailed down. There would still probably be disagreement in this room about it. You're not going to be right the first time you come up with it. As we craft an answer, and this is really hard in that same culture and in the church, dedication is needed to go through a hard process instead of just thinking, hey, what do I think right away? But then patience and humility, because it's going to take a while and you're probably going to be wrong. I don't mean all the way wrong, but somewhat wrong. And I'm probably going to be wrong. I get paid to do ethics stuff. And I teach it like any of the stuff I knew was wrong, I would stop teaching. But I know I'm teaching stuff that's wrong. I'm doing my best with it, but there's nobody who's got it all exactly right. There's going to be places where because of predispositions or because of hermeneutic, errors in scripture, or because of the environment I grew up in, there are places where I will be wrong. I'm not doing that on purpose, but I have to be willing to be corrected. And so as we evaluate new technologies, we want to craft an answer, but then we want to do something that feels horrible. We want to send it out and say, tell me what's wrong with this. This is what I think right now. It's got this weakness, got this weakness, got this weakness. Tell me what's wrong with it. And that we would actually see the church as a community, where rather than each one of us having the whole answer to everything, and I hate to keep poking at masks, but masks make me laugh, both sides, all sides of masks. My viewpoint is very isolated because I think we've just all been so goofy about them. But you think about something like masks, how is it that everybody was an expert on them? I mean, everybody was an expert. No, we're not experts. I know a little science stuff, and I have, I know what nanometers are, and I could sort of figure out how to evaluate some things about the likelihood of a virus going through various kinds of fabrics, but I'm not an expert on masks. And even the experts would say, we got to do 5 years of studies, and then we'll figure out whether it worked or not. Way after the pandemic's over, maybe, hopefully, then we'll know. We just, stop being an expert, have the humility to say, we're going to work on this, and we're going to work on it together. We're going to be a community. And be patient. In vitro fertilization, 60 years. And I expect this is true, when the artificial womb is created, I would expect that at least 60 years later, we'll still be arguing in the church for the right and the wrong uses of it. And like in vitro fertilization, there will be lots of examples of bad uses of it. And like in vitro fertilization, there will be enormous examples of wonderful and beautiful uses of it. And we'll still be arguing about the balance of those. We need to be patient. We need to be a thoughtful community that's willing to listen to each other. All right. So I said before that most of the time technology just moves along. So all this stuff about new technology is great, but often the question isn't how do we stop this? It's how do we live with it? And I want to go back over there, move ahead on that slide. I want to go back to that thought process of what about what's already there? And if you remember, I said unintended consequences become invisible consequences. Now we think about the real guts of Christian ethics and technology. It's not about artificial wombs and what do we say about that. It's not even about the live technologies right now. The most important stuff for us is these unintended consequences that have become invisible consequences. The most important for stuff is going and trying to find those invisible impacts and trying to examine how has technology shaped us in ways that we don't even see. Really willfully looking at our lives and saying, am I living well with this technology? Am I living well with this technology? The last part we'll get to in a little bit, but and am I upset at what other people are doing with technology? Because actually what I want is the old new. In other words, most technology used to be new, but people that wish they had telephones that weren't in their pocket, they just want the old new. Is the reason I'm upset with technology because I want the old new and not the new new. But let's focus in on these first two, and I want to use community and the idea of community as kind of this fits all over the place. The way we live, the way our homes, we talked about the size of homes, we talked about cleaning, we talked about our clothing, but I think community is a great example for us in the church of really saying how has technology impacted community? So I've made this is not comprehensive. I made a list of some technologies that I would say, especially for us in Florida, it's a Florida list, have significantly impacted what counts as your community. Cars, air conditioning, processed foods, and by that I mean anything that's sort of easy, quick to prepare. It could be McDonald's, but it can also just be TV dinners, which was the old new, or any other kind of microwave food that you can pop out real quick. Cell phones, The internet is so big, but think about email, social media, the content algorithms that send you information, try to determine what look past at next, but it goes way on from there. How have these shaped your community? Cars, let me start with the ones that maybe sound odd. Cars, air conditioning, and processed foods. Well, cars we talked about a little bit earlier in terms of where your church is. But cars have done more than just that. If we didn't have cars, primarily people would be working where? Before easy transportation, where do most people work? What's that? They might, if they were in a city, then they might, but public transportation is still, we're kind of in the same ballpark time-wise, but probably if you were in a city, someplace you could walk to, or in many cases, if you were outside of a city, generally you worked, what's that? The land, yeah, sorry, I couldn't hear. Yeah, in your home, or the land around you, or maybe just down the street. Maybe just down the street. So if that was your life, who would your community naturally be as you worked at home, your family, as you walked to work, the people that you ran into, as, by the way, they didn't travel very far. So if you work at if you were to go get a job across the street at Burger King, you might see the same customer every once in a while. You might have one or two regulars, but by and large, you're seeing a different person every time. If you worked at small town America with no public transportation and no cars, Burger King, which is why there wouldn't have been one, it would have been the same people all the time. Your community would be these people around you. But now just think about your neighborhood. Forget the cars part. Now just your neighborhood here in South Florida. If there wasn't air conditioning at 6 o'clock in the evening when you were done with work, what would be the coolest part of your house? Outside, probably the front porch. Now our houses would be built different, like windows would actually open and they'd be bigger and all kinds of things, but you'd be outside and you'd run into neighbors. Now we can't, I don't want to see my neighbors because it's sweaty until about 8 or November, and really not even November. I mean, really they gotta wait. It's like December and then I can make it to March. And then, I don't know them for 9 months of the year. Just the fact that I have air conditioning changes my community. Processed foods, I want you to think about this. We talk about families trying to have family dinner. My family's not great about family dinner. I wish we were better about family dinner. But processed foods, if there weren't so many prepackaged foods, we would have family dinner because otherwise kids wouldn't eat. And kids like to eat. They don't like being around their parents, but they really don't like not eating. If there wasn't an easy way, if it was like, if I don't come to dinner, then I have to get out 17 pots and pans and make something from scratch, or I have to go to the grocery store because we don't have even the refrigeration, get into any number of different things you add to it, it changes the dynamic because there's always something available. We can sort of graze along through the day, and I can be busy and be reading and have a couple snacks, and it gets to be dinner time, and I'm like, I'm not really that hungry. I don't think I want to cook tonight. And I can just say to the kids, why don't you just make something on your own? And they're like, yes. And they go make something that's totally unhealthy, but I don't pay attention to it because my phone is buried my face is buried in my cell phone because of the internet, email, social media, and content algorithms that are sitting there feeding me everything that's wrong with people that think differently than me about masks because I've clicked on masks 4 or 5 times in the last 3 days. The last part is even more obvious how it takes us over. It changes our expectations for relationships. The internet and our cell phones make it possible for us to have closer relationships in some circumstances with people the further away they are. It's not a small number of people. It's not a small number of people who have better relationship in terms of cognitive, emotional engagement with people who are not in their home versus the people who are in their home. We know the joke about our neighbors and we don't know our neighbors anymore. But the reality is our cell phone so brings in an outside world that we can pick and choose that many of us have a better relationship through the phone with people who are not inside of our own walls, our own air-conditioned walls, than we do, that we have a better relationship with people outside than we do those that are inside. In the church, as we think about the church community, everybody knew when COVID happened. Everybody knew when COVID happened, and everybody started live broadcasting, which we all had to do, that a lot of people were never going to come back. And there's a lot of people for whom the internet now is church. This is their church community. And church, that language, we use the word church and we think of buildings, but it's not buildings. It's not that you're not going to church because you're not going to building. You're not going to church because you're not with the people. It's a gathering. It's a community. The church is the people. And Scripture tells us, get with the people. The book of Hebrews in particular says, get there, go there, don't stop getting together. And this is not getting together, but it feels like it. It feels like it, and it becomes invisible. There are people who would say, I am certain there are people who would say, I'm a member and regular attendee of this church there's probably some that have never even been here. That doesn't mean they aren't benefiting from this church. It doesn't mean that it isn't positive that it's available. It's, again, the unintended consequence. The positive side is broadcast it, and then people can still stay connected in some way during COVID. And we did that beforehand. Broadcast it, and then when people have a way to get access when they're not here. But the unintended consequence is people say, hey, you know what's easier than going to church? Let's go to church from the beach today. Let's go to church from the boat today. Let's go to church later. We'll watch the recording after this is done. South Florida is particularly tough that way because there's, always something better to do. It's not the Dolphins, but there's usually something better to do otherwise. It has the unintended consequence that then becomes an invisible consequence. I think there are many people in the U.S. right now who have no idea that not going to church is not okay. It's become invisible to them that there was even a community, and some of that, to go all the way back to the beginning, some of that started when we just got so big that there were so many people in the room that you didn't have to know anybody, that you could be invisible while you're there. It's really not a very big step to just be invisible from home. So looking within ourselves to say, where are those invisible impacts? And now what do I do about them? Now, the community one, I think, is fairly straightforward. I'm not going to tell you that you have to be friends with your neighbors. I'm not going to tell you that you have to have family dinner. I will say you ought to be very, very concerned if you have the best relationships in your life are with people through the screen versus inside of the walls of your home. And you ought to be concerned if your community, when you think about your local community, starts with your phone and people that you're connected with that you couldn't go see within 15 minutes of getting in the car. You ought to be concerned that we need people that we are with. And the phone is wonderful when it allows us to keep connections with people who are not here anymore. That is beautiful and lovely and spectacular. But it's not good when it completely replaces all of that connection that we ought to have locally. So it's looking into the existing technology, trying to figure out what has become normal to me that never would have been normal, then trying to evaluate what parts of that are good, what parts of that are neutral, parts of that are really negative, and then the hard part is trying to fight it off. I know that my phone has produced in me a ridiculous expectation of immediate gratification of every question that I ever have. And I know that's bad, and I know that I ought to be able to, but I have no idea how to fix it. I still want to know. I haven't looked at my phone in like 45 minutes right now. I want to go look. You guys, I know, I've watched you. Most of you have checked, but I haven't gotten to. It's not polite when you're teaching. It's been too long. I need to know. Somebody might have written something important. This is weird and hard to fight off, even though it's become normalized. So looking for that stuff and trying to fight it off is important. But there is another side to it. It's not just the stuff that's become normal to us that we need to fight off. I think there is this last piece of it in terms of seeking the invisible. There are also people who hate the technology. I told you I'm a technology lover. And all of us have been shaped by the technology. But there are also some of us who we just want the old version of new. And we're actually upset at technology, and we think it's an ethical violation. We think it's bad, and it's just because it's not what we're used to. And I think that's also something to look at in terms of if you've got things that are new, that are frustrating to you, to really be willing to ask the question, am I upset with this because it's bad, or am I upset with this because it's new to me? And as I kind of close out, I really love that this is true because I'm going to get kicked out of this church because I really don't like the organ. I don't like the way, it's beautiful to look at. It's beautiful to look at. But I just don't like the way it sounds. I don't like it. That's just personal taste, and you can all think whatever you want about me because of that. But what I think is hilarious is the organ actually represents the newest musical technology that we use in this church. See, the instruments, the drums and the guitar, various forms of guitars, and the piano, the stringed instruments, they actually represent older kinds of musical instruments that have a longer history of being used in the church than a pipe organ, which 1,100, 1,200 years ago was unbelievable, brand new, hyper expensive, over the top technology. And it was new. Now, 1,200 years ago is a long time ago, but that was new 1,200 years ago. Now, if your attitude is you love the organ, that's fine. If you hate the guitars, that's fine. I don't like the organ, I like the guitars, you like the organ. That's just personal taste. But we have churches that divide over it's wrong. It's wrong. You know, musical instruments of various sort. Now, if you're going to have a fight about no instruments at all, then at least you've got something to do. But the organ's not old. The organ's not traditional. Jesus didn't listen to organ music. There were organs, but they weren't in churches for 900 years after he died. And so if a church that doesn't use the organ is a bad church, that's technology. That's technology. It's not quite as awesome to look at. I don't know how it sounds compared to the other one, but that's technology. It's just old technology. We've gotten used to it. But if you think that's good and that's not quite as good and a guitar is evil, that's actually just you wanting the old new. And we do need to take care to think through those things, because that happens a lot, where actually what we're doing is not taking a stand for Christian ethics. We're taking a stand for personal taste and desires. It's a little hard to see. A lot of this is hard to see because, again, the unintended consequences become invisible over time. They become invisible over time. So, kind of, again, the big picture themes here as we finish out. I think we're going to do a little Q&A time. I'm not sure where I was time-wise, but I think we got a little bit left. I forgot there was no clock in the back. 7 minutes. I was a little bit too long, so I apologize for that. Technology always goes forward. Our effort should not be on stopping bad technology. Our effort should be on figuring out, when this happens, how are we going to live with it well? Technology always moves forward, and technology always feeds our sin and makes us want more. It's never satisfactory. It's never enough. We will grow our life. If there's something that you're sure if you just had that, everything would be better, I promise you, you will almost immediately grow your life out to make it normal and to be upset you don't have more of it or more of something else. And that happens with technology consistently. There is a hard process that you need to go through, that we need to go through, that involves patience and humility to be able to dive into Scripture and apply Scripture to new technologies. We need to do that, but we mostly need to do it again to figure out how do we live with this well and adequately. But I think the main thing Christians need to do in terms of technology is examine their own lives right now as they're living and say, how has my life been shaped by the technologies that I'm so used to I can't even see? And what are the areas where that technology is shaping my life in a way that I shouldn't like, that I shouldn't be okay with? And what can I do? What can I do to fight that off? So with that, questions, answers, all that kind of stuff.